Shamaya. It's like papaya, except it's not. And this is Plot Twist Please. Welcome. Y'all, it's been a minute since I've been on here because my laptop was broken, but we're here and we're making it work. So today, I really thought I'd talk about something that has been bouncing around my brain socket. I'm just gonna start out by saying, if you have seen the title of this video, then you probably know already that you're going to have a really visceral reaction to what I'm gonna say. Now's your chance to run. You are either going to leave this video really appreciating it or really hating it. And those are really the only two potential reactions you could have. What I will say also is just pause. Don't get like 30 seconds into this video and already decide how you feel about it. Wait till the end and then start doing your clickety clack and tippity tapping on your computers. But yeah, that's my only request. Just revealed myself to be a little untrustworthy because it's not the only thing I'll ask. The second thing I'll ask is to like, share, and subscribe at the end of this or in the middle of it when you're like, oh, I think I kind of jive with what you're saying. No takes backsies. The reason why I wanted to make this video was because of an article. It was a New York Times article talking about male loneliness and how there's an epidemic of loneliness among men. And then several notable media outlets afterward relaying the same sentiment. My immediate reaction was sympathy because I just am genuinely an empathetic person. And then my second reaction was frustration. just almost like seething frustration. And the frustration was coming from a place of living in a patriarchy. If you don't know, that is based off of research that I'm listing below, as well as in the description, that talks about the history of the United States specifically being rooted in white supremacist patriarchy. And so the thing that really ground my gears about those articles was that all of a sudden, loneliness was an issue when it applied to men. Now, it just seems to me, as someone who works in media, as someone who reads a lot of articles, and in order to prepare for videos like this, or to prepare for interviews and things like that, I read a lot. And I'm not a journalist by any stretch of the imagination. I am not a mental health professional, psychiatrist, psychologist, etc., etc., etc. But I do like to do my due diligence before getting on here. As unserious as I like to be on here, I do like to have sources. And so it does frustrate me seeing the world in upheaval about men being lonely. No, I'm not going to minimize the effect of loneliness because whether you know this or not, loneliness is an epidemic everywhere, especially when it comes to Gen Zers and millennials, people who grew up or had their formative years ingesting images from the internet as a form of communication, oftentimes, especially through this pandemic that we had the past few years. It has become increasingly obvious that loneliness is becoming an issue because people are feeling disconnected from one another, and it seems that the screens are the only way to really connect with each other, whether through happenstance or, habit, having been through a pandemic where you literally had no choice but to connect with each other through solely a screen, or just because of fear of vulnerability. There's a lot of psychological research going into that statement. Not from myself, but from people with PhDs. Specifically, there was one article that pointed to loneliness being the leading cause of death. And what I think is interesting about that is that anyone can be susceptible to it, anybody. But I think what is new, or rather newer in the social zeitgeist, in the social conversation, is the idea that men have to create identities solely based on who they are rather than who they are connected to. One could argue that women have been doing this for generations, have been cultivating our friendships, our sense of self, have been reading our self-help books, have been doing our dating coaching in order to find a mate, have been doing our meditation. And in fact, Black women and Indigenous women have been the trailblazers in such movements, in self-care and self-actualization. They have been the leaders in this. And to speak on a broader scale in terms of westernized society, the biggest market for self-help books, for the self-help industry and at large, is women. Women are buying these books and women are pursuing these coachings. It is the women who are seeking self-actualization and growth. At least it's been that way for the past few decades. It is a very new thing for men to meditate, for men to go to therapy, for men to seek self-help and self-actualization. And for that reason, I think that a lot of men are being able to be conscious of what they've been lacking socially, interpersonally, and intrapersonally, if that's introspectively, and as inside of themselves, inside of here, in here. So what they're realizing is they can't depend on how much money they make, how much income they bring to the table in the relationship. They can't depend on how good they are at being physically intimate with someone, if you can call that intimacy. But they have to rely on who they are. Now, women's standards are raising to the point where they don't want to marry a man because of his income. In fact, many of them don't have to. Many of them have their own sources of income. Many of them are CEOs, So it's not like they are pursuing marriage necessarily for financial gain, but it's like they're pursuing it for personal fulfillment. Now, as I say this, I just want to add a little aside. Some women are very much married, no pun intended, to the idea of being with a man who wants to financially support them and have nothing else to offer than that. Some women are very much tied to the idea of being a housewife, which is not wrong. They are allowed to choose that. Being in the labor force, as we've seen with all these strikes going on, it can feel like a losing game, especially with wages decreasing or wages staying the same and inflation increasing and rent, just completely just deciding that it's just gonna be what it's gonna be and it don't care what nobody thinks. I tell you what, I wish I had as much audacity as these rent prices. All that being said, it just seems like a lot of women now, or at the very least more than past years, are reaching a point where they don't necessarily need a man to be happy. They don't necessarily need a romantic relationship to be happy. They have their friends, which are very fulfilling for them. They have their hobbies, they have their jobs, and they're fairly happy. And they are finding that they don't necessarily need a man in their life to have a fulfilling life. It will be because they want one, not necessarily because they need one. And this makes a lot of men have to reevaluate their place in society, because whereas in previous years, it was kind of easy. It was easier to be in a relationship with a woman because women didn't really have many standards. Now it's like you have to earn your spot. Now it's like you actually have to try in some cases. Some people are still linking up who really just don't want to be lonely and have no business being together. But listen, I am not a relationship therapist. I just observe. I just look around with my own two pupils. And I get it. Listen, I get it. Loneliness is a killer. Loneliness is an epidemic. It just couldn't be me. It just could not be ChamayaMoo. It couldn't be this oil. Listen, it's fine. Like, everyone is allowed to choose what they need to choose to be happy. I just could never be with someone who is not obsessed with me. But that's just me. I decided a long time ago that the man that I end up with literally has to have golden retriever energy around me. But I will save that spiel for the patrons. Speaking of, I need to get that Patreon video up. It will be up by tonight, I promise. I really do think more women are becoming comfortable with the idea of men not liking them. And that also interferes with the courting process for men, because they are used to women, tailoring down to the outfits they choose, down to how they speak, down to their mannerisms to please the man that they want to be with. But a lot of women are deciding that that's just poppycock, that it's hogwash, and are just like, you know what? It's hard enough to survive in this world. If someone isn't going to enhance my life, I'd rather be without. I wanna put another aside here because this video that I'm making in like 2 months might be a little outdated, because we are now emerging what has been coined as a Jane Austen era, where the economic unrest in America is becoming so overbearing that many people are going to have to couple up for financial stability reasons, or going to have roommates, or going to have some sort of partnership just to make ends meet, because things are crazy. One thing you need to know about me is that I am a McDonald's historian. I have read and reread the books on McDonald's history, and all of my records show that McDonald's is getting a little too big for the britches. They're getting a little too ahead of themselves here. They're thinking a little too highly of themselves, because why is it that a small fry and a 10-piece nugget costs like $15. It's like, I could have just gone to Sweet Green. I could have just gone to get my little healthy cow food. Like, I could have just gone to get my, like, hay in a bowl. Sweet Green is actually so delicious, and if you guys want to sponsor me, what I'm trying to say is I could have eaten bird food, but I chose McDonald's because I wanted McDonald's, because I wanted the calories and because I wanted the deal. And if one of those is off the table, I mean, listen, I'm a marketer, so I know. Just level with me, please. What do we as a collective have to do? Because I can guarantee you there will be people willing to do it. So back to men. It's like, what do you expect to happen when you perpetuate a patriarchy? Like, what do the men really expect to happen when they continue to diminish women, when they continue to pursue monetary gain over emotional well-being, or power dynamics in relationships over emotional vulnerability, in any relationship with their friends, outside of any sort of moral obligation or social responsibility? It just frustrates me that it seems like the men who are experiencing this loneliness in their actual interpersonal lives make this women's problem, more specifically heterosexual women's problem. As a woman who dates men, I have found it increasingly unnerving how a lot of men will manipulate this knowledge, will manipulate the idea that they are not as emotionally equipped because they were not raised to be so, that women have more access. Well, okay, that's not even true, but that women have more practice with self-actualization and with developing a sense of self than men. They will weaponize that knowledge and make women feel obligated to fill in the gaps for them. If you don't know anything about weaponized incompetence is one of those methods where a man will say, oh, I can't do this, I don't know how to do it. And then the woman ends up in the relationship with him, ends up having to fill in those gaps. For example, when it comes to house chores, sometimes men will purposefully not try to do the dishes or not try to clean because they know that their female partner is going to do it for them. And so then if she asks him to do something like do the dishes, he'll do it poorly, or he won't try or put in any considerable effort because he knows that in the end that she's just going to end up doing it. There are men who will weaponize the knowledge that women have about their shortcomings in order to make us put in more work. A lot of men will say, and particularly I found this when I am watching a lot of media that centers Black men and Black masculinity. A lot of the time I will see a man on a podcast or something, you know, these manly podcasts, talking about how women have to do this and this and this because men don't know any better. Women have to make these kinds of concessions, have to lower these standards that they have held strong because men don't know any better. It's really like, at what point do you expect men to do anything? Like, at what point do you expect men to fill in the gaps for themselves? At what point are they supposed to be responsible as adults, as individuals with autonomy, to go through a healing process or to pursue some sort of mental well-being without a woman forklifting him through it? Like, it is astounding to me how much media I see just because I'm a Black person who watches Black media sometimes and the algorithm knows it. How often the conversation is around what women need to do better because men don't know how to do something. I understand if you are a mother of a boy, but if you are not a mother of a boy, why is it your responsibility to teach a man how to communicate his feelings? Like I just don't understand. I don't understand. And the sad thing about it is a lot of women are going to concede in that way. A lot of women. And I would argue most heterosexual women in heterosexual relationships will do that. Because that is the price of dating a man, of being partnered with a man. So that is why it frustrates me when articles like this gain such acclaim or so much attention. It's because it's almost like we're only paying attention because a person at the top of the social hierarchy is suffering. And what I've come to find is that the people who are higher up on the social hierarchy are the people who are deemed as deserving of the most empathy or the most care. And that is through conditioning. The other thing about this is that it seems that men who are marginalized in other ways still cannot recognize the ways in which they uplift the patriarchy, still cannot recognize the ways in which they diminish women. Because the only thing they see is their marginalization. They cannot see how they have power in situations. The only way they can potentially see in their interpersonal lives is if they see the exact opposite, is if they see themselves being marginalized. That is the only way marginalization makes sense to them, is if they are the victims. But even in those situations, I have found that sometimes it is still extremely difficult or impossible for them to see how they hold power in a hierarchy, even though they are marginalized in one way. It's like people heard intersectionality and just kind of, it's like when you go to a lecture in college and you're awake for the first like 5 minutes and then you fall asleep for the rest, but you're like, oh, I understood, I get it. You wake up at the end of class, you're like, okay, no, that seems easy. That seems fine. We gonna pass the test, y'all. No, you're not. You might get a C minus. You're not gonna pass. Well, C minus is passing, but we can do better. And the other fact of the matter is, and someone made a TikTok about this that I really appreciated, even though, this is true, even though men have the highest rate of suicide in America, women are most likely to die in America at the hands of their male partners. Homicide. That is the highest rate of female death in America. Not breast cancer, not kidnapping by a stranger, domestic violence. That is how most women in America die. So it's like even though, this is a fact, even though men are suffering through mental health crises every day, they will still be able to push that weight onto their female partners. They will still be able to terrorize women even if they are suffering mentally. And so it's like, okay, like what you want us to do? Like what you want us to do? And here's the thing, this is where I add the caveat. This is where this video takes kind of a turn, because I'm someone who believes in community wellness. I think that individuals cannot heal on their own. In fact, I think that healing through community, through relationships is the most effective. But everyone doesn't need to do that through a romantic relationship. Healing doesn't have to happen through a partner. In fact, if you are someone who could potentially harm somebody else, which is, you know, all of us, but at different degrees, but if you are someone who could cause direct, especially physical harm to somebody else, I do not think you should be dating. I do not think you should be in a relationship. I think you should be getting close to your friends and figuring out what you need to do in therapy, or figuring out what you need to do when you journal or when you go for your run or whatever. But I think that a lot of men require and even demand women to put themselves in the line of fire, to throw themselves in front of buses for them, metaphorically speaking, to literally put themselves in physical and emotional danger for the sake of their betterment, for the sake of their emotional awakenings. And it's like, we're tired. The other reason why it seems really frustrating when women hear things like this is because we've watched our mothers, we've watched our grandmothers, our aunts, labor over hot stoves while their partners sat and watched TV. You know, we've watched our mothers tire themselves out and men continuously say how we need to do more. You know, we watched holidays where the women were sweating and running back and forth and doing shopping and running home and making sure the chicken didn't burn and decorating the house. Like, okay, so what are we getting out of this? What actually are we getting out of partnership with men if this is what it looks like? If it looks like consistent labor at the same time being told that you're not doing enough. And it also looks like being cheated on. And it also looks like being told you're not skinny enough. And it also looks like being told that your skin is too wrinkly, or that, you know, you're not exciting enough, that you've lost your personality because you're exhausted because you have to feed the kids every morning and take them to school and then also do the cleaning and make sure dinner's on the table and make sure the laundry's like it's exhausting thinking about being a housewife. Okay, y'all are superhuman, because I listen. I'm not gonna say it will never be me, because I never say never. As a career woman, that is hard to imagine. I come home from work and I sit. I sit, and I love to sit. Watching the people you care about seem like they're getting the short end of the stick. That's what it is. You know, whether that is true or not, since we don't know the intimacies of relationships, that's what we see. Now we get to the empathy part of this discussion, right? Because what these articles are trying to do is help people who are not men empathize, or help men feel seen. One or both of those things, right? As someone who is extremely empathetic, here's why I think it's not always helpful. Because you can only empathize oftentimes with the people who are most like you, who look like you, or who remind you of someone you know. What comes to mind is how a lot of the time when a white girl goes missing, the nation is in upheaval. Like, people are flipping over tables, the Amber Alerts are going, but when there is a young Black girl who goes missing or is a victim of human trafficking, nobody bats an eye. And that happens every day. And the people who are committing these crimes also know that nobody bats an eye, and so that's why they keep getting away with it. And that's why they keep doing it. So that's why I don't think it's always helpful. Another reason why I don't think it's always helpful is because repeated exposure is a thing. Repeated exposure argues for representation in media, which is something that I fully am in support of. But the notion behind repeated exposure, the psychology behind it, is when people constantly see something, they are more likely to empathize with that. So that's why who you put in your circles, who you're friends with, what you see on TV almost has a direct impact on who you end up empathizing with. And if you don't have a diverse group of friends, or you're not digesting diverse kinds of media or media that has diverse kinds of people on your screen, then you're less likely to empathize with those people. And so that is, I guess, both a case for and against empathy, because if that is happening, good for you, you're going to empathize with a lot of people. But if it's not, then what do you have to pull from? There's also a book called Against Empathy, and that's where I'm getting some of these ideas from. I'm also getting some of my ideas from a YouTuber who I really like. Check their stuff out. And I feel like a lot of the time too, there's a misconception about empathy that it has to be rooted in guilt, that you have to make someone feel bad for you in order for it to be a useful emotion. But that's not true. Like, you know, there was an era, y'all, but way back in a time called the 1990s, there was an epidemic. Okay, let me tell you about an epidemic. It was where celebrities disguised themselves as poor people, as homeless people, as people in prison, etc., in order to empathize with them. Y'all, it was a whole thing. I guess that's the only way some of them felt that they could empathize with those people, but I don't think that it is a requirement. I don't think you have to dress up like a homeless person to know how messed up the system is and how all of us are literally a paycheck away, or 2 paychecks away, or 1 eviction away from homelessness, or 1 accident that you have to pay for away from homelessness. You know, or 1 mental break away from, like, listen, we are closer to homelessness than we think. I really think that there are people who cling to this idea that you have to make someone feel guilty, or you have to be guilty, feel guilty yourself in order to empathize, when guilt is not a useful emotion. This YouTuber I'm talking about also mentions this in one of her videos. Active emotion is what actually causes change. Guilt is stagnant. But one of my favorite things to do in terms of inspiring social change is using creativity, because I think if you can stir up a passion in somebody, that is an active emotion. That can spearhead change. Because when someone is just sitting and feeling bad, what is that going to access? But when someone is excited about something, when someone is passionate about something, when someone sees possibility, that is inspiring. That's why I love art so much. That's why I think art is the gateway to change in a lot of cases, because in order to create a better world, you have to imagine a better world first. Yeah, picturing something outside of this takes a lot of imagination, y'all. But it's really, I think, vital. The thing that I would leave you with is this. I don't think that solely relying on empathy is a reliable method for spearheading social change, because at some point it requires someone to feel something before they move. I would argue you don't always have to feel something before you move. Sometimes you can just know that something is wrong. Sometimes you can just know that somebody's being disenfranchised and that be enough. You know, there are also some people who cannot feel empathy. Literally, they cannot feel it. Like, psychologically, it is not something accessible to them. But everyone who doesn't feel empathy, or everyone who doesn't emulate empathy in a way that you are familiar with, is not a, quote, bad person, is not someone who is nefarious, or it's not someone who's evil. That's just not how it works. You can have good intentions without having empathy, frankly. Though empathy is a useful tool, especially for young children when they're developing, it doesn't have to be our only tool in the toolbox. I also reject the notion that you have to be in somebody else's shoes in order to know that what they're going through is wrong, in order to know that they are suffering. And that is why these articles were irking me, is because it seems like the only way that men are able to understand what women go through is if they are suffering through it themselves. And I just want better for us. I want us to be better than that. Yeah. What is not actually delved into, men who are not used to like going deeper with their male friends don't end up being as fulfilled in their friendships and end up putting the pressure that they would have on their male friends on their female partner. And so then that leaves us having to do more emotional labor in a relationship, you see? Do I think that men should shut up when they have problems? No. And I hope that this doesn't encourage that kind of mentality. If you're a man watching this, you know, you grew up the way that most men do. I'm hoping this is going to motivate you to seek mental wellness in a way that does not put an enormous amount of pressure around the woman around you, but in a way that is empowering. That's all. All right, thanks for joining me. Like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Stay weird.